Hello and welcome to American History Channel. Tonight we're exploring the life of one of the most fascinating people in American history. Benjamin Franklin wasn't just one thing. He was a printer who became wealthy, a scientist who discovered electricity, an inventor who refused to patent his creations, a writer whose wit still makes people laugh, a diplomat who charmed the courts of Europe, and a revolutionary who helped birth a nation. This is a man who left school at age 10, but became one of the most educated people in the world, who started as a runaway apprentice, but ended up dining with kings, who flew kites in thunderstorms and negotiated treaties that changed history. Franklin lived 84 years, from 1706 to 1790. Those 8 decades saw America transform from scattered colonies into an independent nation, and Franklin was at the center of that transformation. But he wasn't born a founding father. He was born the son of a candlemaker in Boston, one of 17 children in a crowded house. Everything he became, he made himself become through curiosity, hard work, and an absolutely irrepressible personality. This is the story of the ultimate self-made man. The person who proved that in America, you could rise from nothing to everything through wit and effort. The man who invented the American dream before America even existed. It's a story about reinvention, about never stopping learning, about using your talents to serve something bigger than yourself. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17th, 1706, in Boston, Massachusetts. Right away, we need to understand something. He was not born into privilege or comfort. His father, Josiah Franklin, made candles and soap for a living. Not exactly a glamorous profession. The family lived in a small house that always smelled of rendered fat and lye. It was crowded, noisy, and anything but elegant. Benjamin was child number 15 out of 17 total. 17 children. Imagine that household. The noise, the chaos, the competition for attention and resources. Being child number 15 meant hand-me-down clothes, sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed, and knowing from early age that the family couldn't afford to invest much in any individual child's future. Josiah Franklin had emigrated from England, seeking religious freedom as a Puritan. He worked hard, provided for his enormous family, but there wasn't money for luxuries. Education beyond the basics was a luxury. Young Benjamin was bright. Everyone could see it. He learned to read at a very young age, devouring any books he could get his hands on. His father noticed his intelligence and had an idea. Josiah thought Benjamin might make a good minister. In Puritan Boston, being a minister was one of the few paths to respect and security for a smart boy without money. So at age 8, Benjamin was sent to Boston Latin School to prepare for ministry. He excelled at school, particularly in writing. But there was a problem: money. Even public education had costs: books, supplies, fees. After less than 2 years, Josiah had to pull Benjamin out. The family simply couldn't afford to continue his education. At age 10, Benjamin's formal schooling ended, forever. Everything else he learned, he taught himself. Think about that. One of America's greatest minds, one of the Enlightenment's brilliant thinkers, had less than 2 years of formal education. Everything he became intellectually, he built through his own effort. At age 10, Benjamin started working in his father's shop, making candles and soap, cutting wicks, pouring hot tallow, measuring out lye. It was tedious, smelly, hard work. He hated it. Absolutely hated it. And he made his feelings known, which must have frustrated his father. Here's this boy, given work in the family business, complaining about it. Benjamin dreamed of going to sea. Boston was a port city, and the ocean called to him with promises of adventure and escape from the candle shop's drudgery. But Josiah had already lost one son to the sea. Benjamin's older brother had drowned. Josiah was not about to lose another child to maritime work. So Josiah looked for an alternative. He took young Benjamin around to various craftsmen in Boston, trying to find a trade that might interest the boy. They visited joiners, bricklayers, turners, braziers. Benjamin watched these craftsmen work, learning a little about each trade. This turned out to be valuable later, giving him practical knowledge of how things were made. But none of these trades captured his interest until they visited his brother James, who had recently started a printing business. The print shop fascinated Benjamin. This was different. This was about words, about ideas, about creating things that people would read and discuss. This wasn't just making physical objects, it was making meaning. In 1718, when Benjamin was 12, he was apprenticed to his brother James. He would work for James until age 21, learning the printing trade in exchange for room, board, and eventual mastery of the craft. Apprenticeship was basically indentured servitude for a set number of years. The apprentice belonged to the master, worked long hours, received no pay, and had to obey absolutely. For someone as independent-minded as Benjamin, this was challenging, and being apprenticed to his older brother made it worse. James treated him not just as an apprentice, but as a little brother to be bossed around. But the printing shop gave Benjamin something invaluable: access to books. Lots of books. Printers often received books from authors and booksellers. Benjamin borrowed them, read late into the night, and returned them before anyone noticed. He became a voracious reader. Philosophy, science, politics, poetry, essays, anything he could find. He was educating himself far beyond what any school would have taught. He also taught himself to write. He found a volume of The Spectator, famous English periodical known for elegant prose. He studied how the essays were constructed, then tried to recreate them from memory, comparing his versions to the originals. Through this self-directed practice, he developed a clear, direct writing style that would later make him famous. Nobody taught him this. He taught himself through observation, practice, and relentless self-improvement. When Benjamin was 15, his brother James started publishing a newspaper called the New England Courant. This was a bold move. Boston already had a newspaper, and James's new venture challenged the establishment. The Courant was satirical, irreverent, willing to criticize authorities. This got James in trouble with Boston's leadership, who didn't appreciate being mocked in print. Benjamin wanted to write for the paper, but James refused. He was just the apprentice. His job was to set type and work the press, not to write. So Benjamin came up with a scheme. He wrote letters under the pseudonym Silence Dogood, supposedly a middle-aged widow with opinions about everything. He slipped these letters under the print shop door at night so James would find them. The Silence Dogood letters were witty, insightful, and popular. James published them eagerly, never knowing his teenage brother was the author. Through 14 letters, Silence Dogood commented on Boston society, education, women's rights, and various social issues. The writing was sophisticated and funny, revealing Benjamin's emerging voice. When James eventually discovered Benjamin was the author, he wasn't pleased. His little brother had been fooling him and proving himself more talented than James wanted to admit. The relationship between the brothers deteriorated. James was jealous and resentful. Benjamin was frustrated being treated as inferior when he knew he was at least James's equal in talent. In 1723, when Benjamin was 17, things came to a head. James got in legal trouble for criticizing authorities, and as punishment, he was forbidden from publishing the newspaper. The solution was to publish under Benjamin's name instead. But this required freeing Benjamin from his apprenticeship indenture, at least officially. James did this, but made Benjamin sign a secret indenture to continue working. This gave Benjamin an idea. He now had proof he wasn't legally bound to James. and he was miserable working for his brother. So he made a bold decision. He would run away. Breaking an apprenticeship was illegal and could have serious consequences, but Benjamin was willing to risk it. At 17 years old, with no money and no plan, he decided to escape and start over somewhere new. This decision to run away, to leave behind everything familiar and strike out on his own, was the first of many times Benjamin Franklin would reinvent himself. He was leaving Boston as a runaway apprentice with nothing. He would arrive in Philadelphia as the beginning of the person who would help create America. In September 1723, 17-year-old Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia after a difficult journey from Boston. He came with almost nothing. A few coins in his pocket, the clothes on his back, and an enormous amount of ambition. The journey itself had been an adventure. He'd snuck onto a boat leaving Boston, paid what little money he had for passage to New York. From there, he traveled by boat and on foot to Philadelphia. He arrived on a Sunday morning, exhausted, hungry, disheveled. He had 3 pennies left. He used them to buy 3 large puffy rolls from a bakery. The image of Franklin walking through Philadelphia's streets with a roll under each arm and one in his mouth, looking ridiculous, became famous. He later wrote about it in his autobiography, laughing at himself. A young woman standing in a doorway watched him pass and laughed at the absurd sight. That young woman was Deborah Reed. A few years later, she would become his wife. But on this morning, she just thought he looked foolish. Philadelphia in 1723 was very different from Boston. Boston was old, established, rigid in its social hierarchies. Philadelphia was newer, more open, more tolerant. Founded by Quakers under William Penn's leadership, Philadelphia had religious tolerance built into its founding principles. Different religions coexisted. Social mobility was more possible. New arrivals could establish themselves more easily. For a runaway apprentice looking to reinvent himself, Philadelphia was perfect. Franklin found work quickly with a printer named Samuel Keimer. His skills from working with James immediately made him valuable. He could set type faster and more accurately than Keimer's other workers. But Keimer was difficult to work for, disorganized and temperamental. Franklin was competent and ambitious. This created friction. During this period, Franklin met Pennsylvania's governor, William Keith. Keith was impressed by the intelligent, articulate young printer. He suggested Franklin should start his own printing business. The problem was money. Starting a business required capital for equipment, supplies, a shop. Franklin had none of this. Keith proposed a solution. He would give Franklin letters of introduction and credit to take to England. In London, Franklin could buy printing equipment and establish business connections. Keith would guarantee the expenses. This seemed like incredible opportunity. At 18 years old, Franklin would travel to England, supported by the governor himself. How could it fail? In 1724, Franklin sailed to London, carrying what he thought were letters of credit from Governor Keith. But when he arrived and opened the letters, he discovered there was nothing there. No credit, no support, nothing. Keith had made promises he never intended to keep. Maybe he'd been drunk when he made them. Maybe he just liked making grand gestures. Either way, Franklin was stranded in London, no money and no way home. This could have been disaster. Instead, Franklin turned it into opportunity. He was in London, one of the world's great cities. He would make the most of it. He found work in London's printing houses, which were far more advanced than anything in the colonies. He learned new techniques, met skilled craftsmen, absorbed everything he could. He worked at 2 of London's premier printing houses, Palmer's and Watts's. These were serious operations producing high-quality work. Franklin's skills improved dramatically. He also experienced London's intellectual life, coffee houses where ideas were debated, bookshops filled with the latest publications, theatres, lectures, discussions. He wrote a philosophical pamphlet arguing against traditional religion. It was probably too clever for his own good, showing off his reasoning abilities, but advocating questionable positions he'd later regret. He made friends, including James Ralph, with whom he shared lodgings. He swam in the Thames, impressing Londoners with his swimming skills. He was living independently, supporting himself, learning constantly. But after about 18 months, he wanted to return to America. A merchant named Thomas Denham offered him work as a clerk and passage back to Philadelphia in 1726. Franklin returned to Philadelphia at age 20, more sophisticated and skilled than when he'd left. He'd survived being stranded in London. He'd proven he could adapt and thrive. He worked for Denham until Denham died suddenly. Then Franklin returned to working for Keimer, though the relationship remained difficult. In 1727, Franklin and several friends formed the Junto, a club for mutual improvement. They met weekly to discuss philosophy, morals, politics, and science. The Junto became central to Franklin's life. It was a network for ideas, for business connections, for civic projects. Many of his later achievements began with discussions at Junto meetings. In 1728, Franklin and a friend, Hugh Meredith, started their own printing business. Meredith's father provided the capital. Franklin provided the skill and energy. The partnership worked because they divided responsibilities clearly. Franklin ran the actual printing operation. Meredith handled business administration. Their shop began winning contracts from the Pennsylvania government. Franklin's quality work and his growing network of connections brought in business. When Meredith wanted out of the partnership due to drinking problems, Franklin borrowed money to buy him out and became sole owner in 1730. Also in 1730, Franklin began a common law marriage with Deborah Reed, the young woman who'd laughed at him arriving with the rolls years earlier. Deborah had married someone else while Franklin was in London, but that husband had abandoned her and disappeared. She couldn't legally remarry, but she and Franklin lived together as husband and wife. This arrangement was socially acceptable in Philadelphia at the time. They would remain together until her death in 1774. Franklin also acknowledged an illegitimate son, William, born around 1730. William's mother's identity remains uncertain. Deborah raised William as her own. This shows Franklin's complicated personal life. He wasn't always conventional or perfectly moral by the standards of his time or ours, but he took responsibility for his son and built a family. By 1730, at age 24, Franklin had established himself in Philadelphia. He owned a successful printing business. He had a family. He was respected in the community. From runaway apprentice to independent businessman in 7 years. It was quite a transformation. But Franklin was just getting started. He'd spent his first 24 years learning, building skills, establishing himself. The next 60 years would be about using those skills to achieve extraordinary things. The candlemaker's son, with 2 years of formal education, was becoming one of colonial America's most influential citizens. And he was doing it entirely through his own effort, intelligence, and relentless drive to improve himself and his community. In 1732, Benjamin Franklin launched what would become one of colonial America's most successful publications, Poor Richard's Almanac. This little book would make him famous and wealthy. Almanacs were popular in colonial America. They provided practical information, weather predictions, planting schedules, astronomical data, tide tables. Every household that could afford one owned an almanac. But most almanacs were dry, purely functional. Franklin saw opportunity to create something different, something useful but also entertaining and wise. He created the character of Richard Saunders, supposedly the almanac's author. Poor Richard was a slightly befuddled but earnest man, whose wife Bridget nagged him to make money from his astronomical knowledge. This framing device let Franklin include humor and personality alongside the practical information. Poor Richard's observations on life, delivered in memorable phrases, became the almanac's biggest draw. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. You've probably heard this. It's from Poor Richard. A penny saved is a penny earned. Poor Richard. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. Also Poor Richard, and a lot funnier than most sayings about hospitality. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Dark humor from Poor Richard. Franklin had a gift for expressing wisdom in short, memorable phrases. He understood that people remember catchy sayings better than elaborate explanations. Many of these sayings weren't original to Franklin. He collected wisdom from various sources, polished it, and presented it through Poor Richard's voice. But he did it so well that most people thought they were his inventions. The almanac was published annually from 1732 to 1758. Each year's edition sold thousands of copies. For colonial America, with its limited literacy and expensive books, this was massive success. The almanac made Franklin wealthy, not just comfortable, but genuinely wealthy. Combined with his printing business and government contracts, his income grew substantially through the 1730s and 40s. But what did Franklin preach through Poor Richard? What wisdom was he selling? Thrift, industry, self-improvement, practical virtue. These were the constant themes. Work hard, save money, don't waste time, improve yourself, help your community, be honest in business, avoid debt, value your reputation. This was the emerging middle-class ethos of 18th century colonial America, distilled and made memorable. Franklin wasn't just reflecting these values, he was helping create and spread them. God helps them that help themselves. This wasn't ancient biblical wisdom, it was Franklin's invention, expressing his conviction that people must take responsibility for improving their own circumstances. Through Poor Richard, Franklin was teaching America how to think about success, virtue, and self-improvement. He was creating what we'd now call the American dream, the idea that through hard work and smart choices, anyone could rise. In 1748, at age 42, Franklin essentially retired from the printing business. He'd made enough money that he didn't need to work anymore. He didn't sell the business outright. He entered into partnership where others ran the operation, and he received substantial share of profits without doing the daily work. This gave him freedom to pursue other interests: science, civic projects, eventually politics. But first, he wanted to improve his community. Franklin believed in what we'd now call civic engagement. He thought successful people had responsibility to improve society, not just enjoy their wealth privately. Through the 1730s and 40s, he'd already started several civic projects. In 1731, he helped found the Library Company of Philadelphia, America's first subscription library. Members paid dues, and the money purchased books that all members could borrow. This seems normal now, but it was revolutionary then. Books were expensive. Most people owned few or none. A shared library made knowledge accessible to people who couldn't afford private book collections. Franklin loved this idea, pooling resources so everyone benefited. One person couldn't afford a good library, but 50 people together could. In 1736, he organized Philadelphia's first volunteer fire company, the Union Fire Company. Fire was constant danger in cities built primarily of wood. Organized firefighting could save lives and property. Other fire companies formed soon after, following Franklin's model. Philadelphia developed one of colonial America's best fire protection systems. In 1742, Franklin invented the Franklin stove, an iron heating device that heated rooms more efficiently than traditional fireplaces. It used less wood and produced more heat. He could have patented this invention and made enormous amounts of money from it, but he refused. He wanted the invention to benefit society freely. This became his pattern with inventions. He created numerous devices and improvements, but almost never patented them. He believed knowledge and innovation should serve the public good. In 1743, Franklin proposed creating the American Philosophical Society, an organization for advancing useful knowledge in science and practical matters. It became one of America's premier intellectual institutions. He helped establish Pennsylvania Hospital in 1751, America's first hospital. He organized fundraising, convinced the Pennsylvania Assembly to provide matching funds, and helped plan the institution. He helped reorganize the Philadelphia City Watch into something resembling a police force. He advocated for paving and lighting city streets. Almost every civic improvement in Philadelphia between 1730 and 1750, Franklin's involvement. He was constantly asking, what would make this city better? What would improve people's lives? And he didn't just propose ideas. He organized people, raised money, handled logistics. He was a doer, not just talker. His method was to form voluntary associations, get together a group of interested people, pool resources, take action. Don't wait for government. Do it yourself, cooperatively. This model of civic improvement through voluntary associations became deeply American. It's one of Franklin's lasting influences on American culture. By 1750, Franklin, at age 44, was wealthy, semi-retired from business, famous for Poor Richard's Almanac, and respected as Philadelphia's leading citizen. He'd achieved success beyond what anyone born in his circumstances could normally expect. The candlemaker's son, with minimal education, had become one of colonial America's most prominent men. But he wasn't satisfied. He'd proven he could succeed in business. He'd improved his community. Now he wanted to understand the natural world. He was about to become a scientist, and his experiments would make him famous not just in America, but throughout the Western world. In the 1740s, Benjamin Franklin became fascinated with electricity. This was a new field. People knew electricity existed, but didn't understand what it was or how it worked. Franklin saw demonstrations of electrical experiments in 1744 and was captivated. He obtained electrical equipment and began conducting his own experiments with friends from the Junto. He approached these experiments with practical mindset. He wasn't interested in electricity just as curiosity. He wanted to understand it well enough to use it for beneficial purposes. Through meticulous experiments, Franklin developed theories about electricity that were remarkably accurate. He proposed that electricity was a single fluid that could be present in excess or deficiency. He invented the terms positive and negative to describe these states. We still use these terms today. Much of electrical terminology, battery, charge, conductor, came from Franklin or was popularized by him. He conducted hundreds of experiments, carefully documenting results and developing theories to explain what he observed. He was doing serious science, as rigorous as anyone in Europe. In 1749, Franklin proposed his most famous experiment, proving that lightning was electrical in nature. People had speculated about this, but nobody had proven it. Franklin designed an experiment to test it. He proposed using a long metal rod to draw electricity from storm clouds, demonstrating that lightning and laboratory electricity were the same phenomenon. The famous kite experiment supposedly happened in June 1752. According to the story, Franklin flew a kite with a metal wire during a thunderstorm, with a key attached to the string. When lightning struck nearby, electricity traveled down the wet string and created sparks at the key. Whether this experiment actually happened exactly as described is debated by historians. But Franklin clearly proved lightning was electrical, either through this experiment or others. More importantly, he invented the lightning rod, a metal rod placed on top of buildings and grounded to the earth. When lightning struck, electricity traveled safely down the rod into the ground rather than causing fire. This was practical application of science that saved lives and property. Buildings with lightning rods were dramatically less likely to burn from lightning strikes. Lightning rods were adopted widely in America and Europe. They were Franklin's most important practical invention, saving countless buildings from destruction. Franklin published his electrical experiments and theories in a series of letters that were collected and published in England in 1751 as Experiments and Observations on Electricity. This book made Franklin internationally famous. Here was a colonial American from the cultural periphery making original contributions to science that European scientists respected. The Royal Society in London, England's premier scientific organisation, awarded Franklin the Copley Medal in 1753, their highest honour. He was elected a member in 1756. Universities gave him honorary degrees. Edinburgh, St Andrews, Oxford, all recognised his scientific contributions. The candlemaker's son, with 2 years of formal schooling, became Dr. Franklin. This international scientific reputation would later prove crucial. When Franklin went to Europe as American diplomat during the Revolution, he wasn't unknown provincial. He was famous Dr. Franklin, the electrical scientist. This gave him credibility and access. But Franklin didn't limit himself to electricity. He was curious about everything. He studied ocean currents, particularly the Gulf Stream, and created maps helping ships navigate more efficiently. He investigated weather patterns and storms, developing early meteorological theories. He studied heat absorption and radiation, noting that dark colors absorbed more heat than light colors. This led him to suggest people wear light-colored clothing in summer. He invented bifocal glasses to solve his own vision problems. He needed glasses for reading, but different ones for distance. Rather than constantly switching, he created lenses divided into 2 sections. He invented a flexible urinary catheter to help his brother, who suffered from kidney stones. He designed a mechanical hand for reaching high shelves. He created an improved ship anchor. He proposed theories about the common cold, about lead poisoning, about countless topics. His scientific method was always the same: careful observation, experimentation, logical reasoning, practical application. He wanted to understand the natural world and use that understanding to improve people's lives. Franklin also popularized science in America. He wrote about his experiments in accessible language. He demonstrated electrical experiments publicly. He encouraged others to pursue scientific knowledge. He helped create culture that valued practical science and innovation. This became part of American identity, the practical tinkerer who invents solutions to problems. In 1743, Franklin had proposed forming the American Philosophical Society for promoting useful knowledge. This became America's first scientific society, bringing together people interested in natural philosophy, science. Through all this scientific work, Franklin maintained his civic involvement and was getting more involved in politics. In 1748, he was elected to Philadelphia's Common Council. In 1749, he became Justice of the Peace. In 1751, he was elected to Pennsylvania Assembly. His business success had given him financial freedom. His scientific achievements had given him fame. Now he was building political influence. But the 1750s would bring challenges that would pull Franklin into larger political struggles. The relationship between American colonies and British government was becoming strained. Franklin, who'd always considered himself proud British subject, would be forced to choose sides. The choices he made would transform him from loyal colonist into revolutionary. His scientific work had made him famous. His political work would make him one of America's founders. In 1757, Benjamin Franklin sailed to London as Pennsylvania Assembly's representative. He expected to stay a few months. He would remain in England, with brief returns to America, for most of the next 18 years. This period reveals Franklin's slow, painful transformation from loyal British subject to revolutionary. It's important to understand, Franklin loved Britain. He was proud to be British. He didn't start as a rebel. The immediate issue sending Franklin to London was a dispute between Pennsylvania Assembly and the Penn family, who owned Pennsylvania as proprietary colony. The Penns lived in England as absentee landlords. They owned vast amounts of Pennsylvania land, but refused to pay taxes on it. The Assembly wanted to tax Penn lands to fund defense and public services. Franklin's job was to negotiate with the Penns and present the Assembly's case to British authorities. This seemed straightforward political errand, but Franklin found himself drawn into Britain's political and social world in ways that changed him. In London, Franklin was celebrity. Dr. Franklin, the famous electrical scientist. He was invited to social events, scientific meetings, intellectual gatherings. He met leading British scientists, philosophers, politicians. He was elected to the Royal Society. He received honorary degrees from universities. He loved it. London was the centre of British culture, and Franklin was welcomed into its highest circles. For someone from Boston candlemakers' family, this was heady stuff. He rented a house on Craven Street near the Thames, where he lived with his landlady, Mrs. Margaret Stevenson, and her daughter Polly. They became like family to him. Deborah Franklin refused to cross the Atlantic, afraid of sea travel. So Franklin lived in London, essentially separated from his wife, maintaining the relationship through letters. His son William was with him in London, studying law. William loved London even more than his father did, and cultivated English gentlemen's mannerisms. Franklin spent years in London negotiations, enjoying British cultural and intellectual life. He travelled through England and Scotland, visiting universities and scientific colleagues. During this time, Franklin imagined a British empire where American colonies were equal partners with Britain, not subordinate provinces. He envisioned a grand Anglo-American union spanning the Atlantic. In 1754, before going to London, Franklin had proposed the Albany Plan of Union at a congress addressing colonial defense. His plan proposed uniting the colonies under a Grand Council that could raise troops, levy taxes, and manage relations with Native Americans. It was America's first serious proposal for colonial unity. Neither British authorities nor colonial assemblies liked it. Britain thought it gave colonies too much independence. Colonies thought it gave Britain too much control. But Franklin's thinking was clear. Colonies needed to coordinate better, and Britain needed to treat them more fairly. These themes would dominate his political thinking for the next 20 years. In 1762, Franklin returned briefly to Philadelphia. His London mission had somewhat succeeded. The Penn lands would be taxed, though the fight wasn't completely won. But he was sent back to London in 1764, this time representing multiple colonies. His role was expanding beyond just Pennsylvania issues. The 1760s brought escalating tensions between Britain and America. The 7 Years' War, called French and Indian War in America, had ended in 1763 with British victory. But the war had been expensive. Britain had enormous debts. British politicians looked to American colonies to pay their share. The colonies, from British perspective, had benefited from the war. French threat was eliminated. British military had protected them. Surely they could help pay the costs. From colonial perspective, they'd raised militias, fought alongside British troops, and suffered losses. They contributed to the war effort. British demands for more money seemed unfair. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring colonists to purchase stamps for legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and other items. This was direct tax on colonies without their consent. Americans erupted in protest. No taxation without representation! The colonies weren't represented in Parliament. How could Parliament tax them? Franklin initially underestimated colonial anger. He even suggested a friend for the position of stamp distributor in Philadelphia, not realizing how hated the position would be. But as protests intensified, Franklin recognized the depth of American opposition. He appeared before Parliament in 1766 to testify against the Stamp Act. His testimony was masterful. He explained American grievances clearly and forcefully. He warned that enforcing the Stamp Act would require military occupation. He made Parliament understand this was a serious crisis. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, partly due to Franklin's testimony. This made him a hero in America. But Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting their right to tax colonies whenever they chose. Franklin still hoped for reconciliation. He believed Britain and America could work out their differences. Both sides just needed to be reasonable. Through late 1760s and early 1770s, he tried to build bridges. He wrote essays explaining American positions to British readers. He advised British politicians on colonial policy. But events kept making reconciliation harder. The Townshend Acts imposed new taxes. The Boston Massacre in 1770 inflamed tensions. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 brought crisis. The turning point for Franklin personally came with the Hutchinson Letters affair in 1772 to 1774. Franklin obtained private letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, Massachusetts governor, to British officials. These letters suggested using force to suppress American liberties. Franklin sent the letters to Massachusetts, where they were published, creating scandal. Hutchinson's reputation was destroyed. British authorities were furious that Franklin had leaked private correspondence. In January 1774, Franklin was called before the Privy Council and publicly humiliated. He stood silently while Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn verbally abused him for an hour, calling him a thief and worse. This public humiliation transformed Franklin. He'd spent years trying to bridge the gap between Britain and America. He'd been celebrated in British society, made friends, built connections. Now he was being treated like a criminal in front of Britain's ruling elite. Something broke in Franklin during that humiliation. His loyalty to Britain, his hope for reconciliation, his belief that reasonable people could work things out, all of it shattered. He left the Privy Council in silence. Within months, he would leave Britain and return to America. When he arrived in Philadelphia in May 1775, he was no longer a loyal subject trying to save the empire. He was a revolutionary ready to destroy it. Benjamin Franklin returned to Philadelphia on May 5, 1775. The day after he arrived, he was elected to the Second Continental Congress. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic. 3 weeks earlier, British soldiers and colonial militia had fought at Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. Franklin was 69 years old, ancient by 18th century standards. He'd spent most of the previous 18 years in London. He could have stayed neutral, retired to comfortable obscurity. Instead, he threw himself into the revolutionary cause with remarkable energy. The Continental Congress was gathering in Philadelphia to coordinate colonial response to British military actions. Franklin's presence gave the Congress credibility and experience it desperately needed. He was famous internationally, he had political experience, he understood British government from years in London. He was a valuable asset. Franklin joined several committees immediately. He helped draft Continental Army regulations. He worked on currency issues. He advised on military strategy. In June 1775, Congress appointed George Washington commander of the Continental Army. Franklin supported this choice. Washington had military experience and the dignity needed for the role. Through 1775 and early 1776, Congress debated what they were actually doing. Were they fighting for rights within British Empire or for independence? Many delegates hoped for reconciliation. They wanted Britain to respect American rights, but they didn't want to break away completely. Franklin had already reached his conclusion. He'd seen British attitudes up close. He knew reconciliation was impossible. Britain would never treat colonies as equals. Independence was the only option. In June 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration explaining why colonies were separating from Britain. The committee included Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson did most of the writing. He was a brilliant writer, and everyone recognized it. But Franklin made suggestions that improved the document. Jefferson's draft included a passage blaming King George for the slave trade. Franklin suggested removing it. Several southern colonies depended on slavery and wouldn't support a document condemning it. This was practical politics. Franklin professionals opposed slavery and would later become an abolitionist. But in 1776, unity mattered more than perfect principles. Franklin also edited Jefferson's prose slightly. Where Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," Franklin changed it to, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." This was improved writing. Self-evident is clearer and more forceful than sacred and undeniable. It's the version we remember. On July 4th, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Franklin, at age 70, was one of the signers. The story goes that John Hancock, signing first with his large signature, said, "We must all hang together." Franklin supposedly replied, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Whether this exchange actually happened doesn't matter. It captures the stakes. These men were committing treason against Britain. If they lost, they'd be executed. Franklin was risking everything he'd built over 70 years. His wealth, his reputation, his safety. If Britain won, he'd be hanged as a traitor. But he'd made his choice. He was all in for American independence. In late 1776, Congress asked Franklin to undertake a mission that would use all his diplomatic skills. They wanted him to go to France and secure French support for American independence. France was Britain's traditional enemy. If America could get French military and financial support, they'd have a real chance of winning. Without it, the revolution would probably fail. Franklin was the obvious choice. He was famous in France. His electrical experiments were known. His writings were translated into French. He was international celebrity. In October 1776, at age 70, Franklin set sail for France on a mission that would last 9 years and help determine whether American independence would succeed or fail. The voyage was dangerous. British ships controlled the Atlantic. If Franklin's ship was captured, he'd be arrested as a traitor and probably executed. But he made it to France and arrived in Paris in December 1776. What happened next was remarkable. Franklin became a sensation in French society. His combination of scientific fame, political importance, and personal charm made him enormously popular. The French saw him as embodiment of American virtue, simple, natural, wise, uncorrupted by European aristocratic decadence. Franklin played this role brilliantly. Instead of wearing fashionable wigs, he wore his own thinning grey hair. Instead of elaborate court dress, he wore simple brown suits. He presented himself as frontier philosopher, though he'd lived in cities his entire life. The French loved it. Poor Richard had come to Paris. They couldn't get enough of him. Franklin's image appeared on medals, snuff boxes, rings, prints. French ladies wore their hair à la Franklin. He was a cultural phenomenon. But underneath the celebrity, Franklin was working intensely to secure French support. This required delicate diplomacy. France was interested in helping America, but hesitant to commit openly. They didn't want to provoke war with Britain unless American independence seemed achievable. Franklin had to convince French government that America could win. He had to negotiate financial support, military assistance, and eventually a formal alliance. This took years of patient negotiation. Franklin met with French foreign ministers, cultivated relationships with influential French aristocrats, and slowly built support for American cause. He also ran intelligence operations from Paris, coordinating with other American agents, sending reports to Congress, managing propaganda efforts in European press. At 70 years old, when most people would be thinking about retirement, Franklin was conducting high-stakes international diplomacy that would help determine whether America would exist. His health wasn't great. He suffered from gout and kidney stones, but he kept working, kept negotiating, kept charming French society. In February 1778, after more than a year of negotiation, France signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. This was diplomatic triumph. France committed to military support until American independence was secured. They provided money, weapons, and eventually troops and naval support. The French alliance transformed the war. What had been colonial rebellion became international conflict with major European power supporting America. Without French assistance, America probably would have lost. Franklin's diplomacy in Paris was as important as Washington's generalship in the field. After securing the French alliance in 1778, Franklin remained in Paris as America's minister to France. He would stay until 1785, nearly 9 years total. These were crucial years for American independence. The war continued until 1783. Even after military victory, diplomatic challenges remained. Franklin was at the center of all of it. Living in Paris wasn't hardship for Franklin. He loved French culture. He admired French intellectual life. He enjoyed French society's attention and acclaim. He lived in Passy, a suburb of Paris, in a house provided by a French supporter. It was elegant, comfortable, surrounded by gardens. He had servants, a wine cellar, and constant stream of visitors. He held court like an elderly sage. Scientists, philosophers, writers, politicians, all visited to meet the famous Dr. Franklin. He entertained graciously, conversed brilliantly, and enjoyed being the center of attention. But he was also working constantly. Managing American diplomatic efforts in Europe was enormously complex. He handled negotiations with French government for financial support. America desperately needed money. The Continental Congress couldn't tax effectively. They depended on French loans to keep the war effort going. Franklin had to repeatedly request more money while maintaining good relations. This required delicate balance. Ask too aggressively, and you risk alienating your allies. Ask too timidly, and you don't get what you need. He managed American privateers operating from French ports. These ships captured British merchant vessels, disrupting British trade. This was semi-legal warfare that required diplomatic protection. He dealt with American prisoners held by British. He arranged exchanges, provided support, and tried to improve their treatment. He coordinated with other American diplomats in Europe. John Adams joined him in Paris. Later, Thomas Jefferson would as well. These relationships were sometimes smooth, sometimes contentious. Adams and Franklin had very different styles. Adams was prickly, moralistic, suspicious of French luxury. Franklin was relaxed, pragmatic, comfortable with French aristocratic society. They clashed repeatedly. Adams thought Franklin was too lazy and too fond of French flattery. Franklin thought Adams was too rigid and tactless. But they worked together because they had to. American independence required it. Franklin also conducted propaganda efforts. He managed a private press at Passy, where he printed materials supporting American cause for European audiences. He wrote essays, some under pseudonyms, promoting American independence and criticizing British policy. He planted stories in European newspapers. He was conducting information warfare before the term existed. Through all this, he maintained his scientific interests. He corresponded with European scientists. He conducted experiments. He theorized about natural phenomena. His mind never stopped working, never stopped being curious about how things worked and how they might be improved. The war turned in America's favor after 1778, largely due to French support. But winning military victory and securing diplomatic recognition of independence were different challenges. In October 1781, British forces under Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. This was essentially the end of major fighting, but Britain hadn't formally acknowledged American independence. Peace negotiations began in Paris in 1782. The American negotiating team included Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They faced complex diplomatic situation. France was America's ally, but France had its own interests that didn't always align with American interests. Spain was France's ally, but not America's. Spain wanted to limit American Western expansion to protect Spanish territories. Britain was exhausted and willing to make peace, but they wanted the best terms possible. Franklin and his colleagues had to navigate all these competing interests while securing American independence and favorable boundaries. The negotiating instructions from Congress said to consult with France and follow their advice. But Franklin, Adams, and Jay decided to negotiate directly with Britain without telling France everything. This was risky. If France discovered they were being cut out, the alliance might fracture. But the American diplomats didn't entirely trust France to protect American interests. Franklin's role was crucial. He maintained good relations with the French while secretly negotiating with Britain. He balanced honesty with strategic necessity. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, gave America more than anyone expected. Britain recognized American independence. The boundaries were generous, extending to the Mississippi River. Fishing rights off Newfoundland were secured. Treatment of loyalists was addressed. It was comprehensive peace that established United States as independent nation. Franklin had helped negotiate one of history's most important treaties. American independence was now international reality. After the treaty, Franklin remained in Paris for 2 more years. Congress wanted him to stay as minister to France. His presence maintained good relations with America's crucial ally. He was now nearly 80 years old. His health was declining. Kidney stones caused constant pain. He suffered from gout. He was ready to go home. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson arrived to replace him. Franklin gratefully prepared to return to America. When he left Paris, it was triumphal departure. French society honored him with celebrations. The king granted him a miniature portrait surrounded by diamonds. He was beloved in France in ways few foreigners ever achieved. The voyage home in July 1785 was Franklin's last Atlantic crossing. He used the time to write scientific papers about navigation and ocean currents. His mind was active until the end. He arrived in Philadelphia in September 1785 to enormous celebration. Crowds greeted him, bells rang, cannons fired salutes. He'd left America in 1776 when independence was uncertain hope. He returned in 1785 to an established nation he'd helped create. He was 79 years old. He'd achieved more than most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. He could finally retire and enjoy his final years in peace. Except that wasn't Franklin's style. One more important task remained. Benjamin Franklin returned from France in 1785, expecting retirement. He was 79, in constant pain from kidney stones and gout, exhausted from 9 years in Europe. But America needed him again. The United States in 1786 faced serious problems. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, weren't working well. The national government was weak. It couldn't tax. It couldn't regulate commerce effectively. It couldn't enforce treaties. States acted like independent countries, sometimes working against each other. Something needed to change, or the young nation might fall apart. In May 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Their job was to fix the Articles of Confederation. Franklin, despite his age and health, was elected as one of Pennsylvania's delegates. He was the oldest person there by far. Most delegates were in their 30s or 40s. The convention met in the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. Now, instead of declaring independence, they were trying to create a government. Franklin couldn't contribute as actively as he once would have. The summer heat in Philadelphia was brutal. His health limited his energy. He often didn't speak at length during debates, but his presence mattered enormously. He was the only person in the room who'd signed the Declaration of Independence. He was internationally famous. He represented continuity with the revolution itself. When Franklin did speak, people listened. His comments were usually brief, but often decisive. The convention quickly decided they weren't just fixing the articles, they were writing an entirely new constitution, creating a much stronger national government. This was controversial. Some delegates worried about creating a government too powerful. Others thought strong central government was essential. Debates were intense and often contentious. Large states and small states fought about representation. Northern and southern states disagreed about slavery. The delegates almost walked out several times. Franklin worked behind the scenes to build consensus. He was too old for grand oratory, but he was perfect for quiet conversations, finding compromises, soothing egos. One major conflict was between large and small states. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equal representation for each state. Neither side would budge. The convention was deadlocked. Franklin proposed a compromise that eventually became the Connecticut Compromise. Create 2 legislative houses, one based on population, House of Representatives, one with equal representation per state, Senate. This wasn't Franklin's original idea, but his support helped it gain acceptance. His reputation made compromises respectable. Another crisis came over the presidency. How powerful should the president be? How should the president be elected? Should there be one president or several? Franklin had concerns about creating an elected monarchy. He'd seen how power corrupted. But he recognized America needed executive authority to function. He proposed that executive officers should serve without salary, living on the honor of service. This was ignored. Nobody thought it was practical. But his proposal revealed his values. Public service should be about serving the public, not about personal gain. Throughout the summer, as debates raged and tensions rose, Franklin was the conciliator. When delegates threatened to leave, he persuaded them to stay. When factions formed, he worked to bridge them. By September 1787, the convention had created a draft constitution. It wasn't perfect. Everyone had compromises they'd accepted reluctantly. Franklin himself wasn't entirely happy with it. He had reservations about several provisions, but he recognized that perfect was the enemy of good. On the last day of the convention, September 17th, Franklin made one final speech. Too weak to deliver it himself, he had James Wilson read it for him. He acknowledged the Constitution wasn't perfect. He admitted he didn't agree with all of it, but he said he would support it because it was the best they could achieve. He urged all delegates to sign despite their reservations. He said that showing united support for the Constitution would help it be ratified. I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions, even on important subjects. This was vintage Franklin, humble despite his achievements, practical despite his principles, focused on what could be achieved rather than what was ideal. He ended with a call for unity. I hope, therefore, that for our own sakes as a part of the people, and for the sake of posterity, we shall act heartily and unanimously in recommending this Constitution. Most delegates signed. The Constitution was sent to the states for ratification. Franklin's support was crucial during ratification debates. When opponents criticized the Constitution, supporters could point to Franklin's endorsement. If the great Dr. Franklin approved, it must be worthwhile. The Constitution was ratified and took effect in 1789. Franklin had helped create the framework for American government that still exists today. He was 81 years old. He'd participated in creating the Declaration of Independence, negotiating the Treaty of Paris, and drafting the Constitution. Few people in history have influenced the creation of a nation so comprehensively. In his final years, Franklin turned his attention to one more cause: ending slavery. He'd owned slaves earlier in life. Like many wealthy colonials, he'd accepted slavery as normal. But his thinking had evolved. In 1787, he became president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery. This was radical position for someone of his generation and background. In March 1790, months before his death, Franklin signed a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. It was one of his last public acts. He died on April 17, 1790, at age 84. 20,000 people attended his funeral in Philadelphia, the largest gathering the city had ever seen. News of his death was received with mourning in America and Europe. France's National Assembly declared a period of mourning for him, an unprecedented honor for a foreigner. Franklin left a will distributing his property carefully. He left money to Boston and Philadelphia for charitable purposes. He freed his slaves and left money to them. He left his scientific instruments to friends and institutions. He left personal items to family members with notes explaining why each item mattered. Even his will showed his practical wisdom and his concern for making the world better. To understand Benjamin Franklin's influence, we need to look beyond his political and scientific achievements to his ideas and how he communicated them. Franklin was a brilliant writer. His prose was clear, direct, often humorous. He could explain complex ideas simply, without dumbing them down. He wrote constantly: newspaper articles, scientific papers, political essays, personal letters, his autobiography. Through all these writings, he developed and spread ideas that shaped American culture. Poor Richard's Almanac, which we discussed earlier, was his most popular work. But his autobiography, written late in life, might be his most influential. Franklin began writing his autobiography in 1771 while in England. He worked on it intermittently for years, never quite finishing it. The autobiography is remarkable for several reasons. It's entertaining, full of anecdotes and observations. It's honest about his mistakes and shortcomings. And it presents a philosophy of self-improvement that became quintessentially American. Franklin describes his method for developing virtues. He identified 13 virtues he wanted to cultivate: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He created a chart and tracked his daily practice of each virtue, trying to master one before moving to the next. He treated moral improvement like a scientific experiment. Did it work? Franklin admits he never achieved perfection, but he believed the attempt made him better than he would have been otherwise. This approach to self-improvement, systematic and practical, influenced generations of Americans. The idea that you could deliberately remake yourself through disciplined effort became central to American culture. Franklin also developed ideas about education that were ahead of his time. He believed education should be practical, not just classical. Traditional education emphasized Latin, Greek, and ancient literature. Franklin thought this was too narrow. He advocated teaching science, modern languages, practical skills. He helped found what became the University of Pennsylvania with this philosophy. Education should prepare people to be effective citizens and productive members of society. His ideas about civic organization and voluntary associations also had lasting impact. Franklin believed problems should be solved through cooperative effort, not just individual action or government intervention. Form a group of interested people, pool resources, take action. This model of voluntary association became a distinctly American approach to civic improvement. Fire companies, libraries, hospitals, universities, all following this pattern. Government didn't create these institutions. Citizens did, working together voluntarily. Franklin's religious views were complex. Raised Puritan, he rejected many traditional Christian doctrines, but remained broadly religious. Believed in God, but was skeptical of organized religion's claims. He thought all religions that promoted virtuous behavior were valuable, regardless of their specific doctrines. He rarely attended church, but supported various denominations financially. He thought religious diversity was healthy for society. This practical, tolerant approach to religion was very different from Puritan rigidity he'd grown up with. It represented more enlightened, rational approach to faith. Franklin's political philosophy emphasized moderation and compromise. He distrusted ideological purity and absolute positions. He believed good government required balancing interests, finding middle ground, accepting imperfect solutions. This pragmatic approach shaped American political culture. The Constitution itself, with its checks and balances and built-in compromises, reflects this Franklinian pragmatism. Franklin also had interesting ideas about economics. He wasn't a systematic economic thinker like Adam Smith, but he had practical insights. He believed in value of productive labor. He thought people should earn wealth through useful work, not speculation or inheritance alone. He advocated frugality and saving, but not miserliness. Money should be used wisely, including for public benefit, not hoarded selfishly. His essay, The Way to Wealth, compiled from Poor Richard's sayings, presented these economic values in memorable form. Work hard, save money, avoid debt, invest wisely. This became American middle-class economic ethic. The Protestant work ethic, American style. Franklin's scientific thinking was characterized by practical focus and experimental method. He wasn't interested in abstract theorizing. He wanted to understand natural world well enough to use it beneficially. His electrical work wasn't just curiosity, it led to lightning rods that protected buildings. His studies of ocean currents helped ships navigate. His inventions solved practical problems. This approach to science, applied and useful, became American scientific tradition. Americans would be known for practical innovation, not just theoretical breakthroughs. Franklin also thought deeply about American identity. What did it mean to be American rather than British? He saw Americans as practical, industrious, innovative, egalitarian, less concerned with social hierarchy and tradition than Europeans, more focused on individual merit and useful achievement. This self-image that Franklin helped create became central to American identity. Americans saw themselves as practical people who valued what works over what's traditional. Franklin's diplomatic style also revealed his philosophy. He believed in patience, humor, and personal relationships. He charmed people rather than confronting them directly. He found common ground rather than emphasizing differences. He was willing to compromise on details while protecting essential principles. This diplomatic approach worked brilliantly in France. The French responded to his combination of wit, wisdom, and warmth in ways they might not have responded to a more rigid diplomat. Franklin's views on slavery evolved significantly over his life. Early on, he accepted slavery as normal, even owned slaves himself. But by his later years, he'd become convinced slavery was morally wrong and economically harmful. His petition to Congress calling for abolition showed how far his thinking had evolved. This evolution itself reflects Franklin's intellectual openness. He was willing to change his views when he became convinced he'd been wrong. This intellectual humility was one of his greatest virtues. Franklin's legacy as thinker isn't one systematic philosophy, but rather a collection of practical wisdom, experimental method, and values that shaped American culture. The emphasis on self-improvement, the belief that anyone could rise through merit and effort, the focus on practical results over abstract theorizing, the conviction that civic engagement improves society, the tolerance for religious diversity, the comfort with compromise and pragmatism, the humor and humility even while achieving great things. All of this became recognizably American, and much of it can be traced to Franklin's influence. Benjamin Franklin's inventions and innovations touched almost every aspect of daily life in his era. What's remarkable is that he refused to patent most of them, believing knowledge should benefit everyone freely. We've mentioned the Franklin stove, invented in 1742, but understanding what problem it solved reveals Franklin's practical approach. Colonial homes were heated by fireplaces, which were inefficient. Most of the heat went up the chimney. Rooms with fireplaces might be warm near the fire, but cold elsewhere. And fireplaces consumed enormous amounts of wood. Franklin designed an iron stove that sat in the room rather than being built into the wall. It radiated heat in all directions. It had channels that allowed heated air to circulate. It burned wood more efficiently. The Franklin stove could heat a room with 1/4 of the wood a fireplace required. This saved money and labor. It made homes more comfortable. Pennsylvania's governor offered Franklin a patent, which would have made him very wealthy. Franklin refused. He wanted the invention available to everyone. He wrote, "As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously." This attitude toward invention was unusual then and remains unusual now, but it was quintessentially Franklin. The lightning rod, invented around 1752, was perhaps his most important invention. Before lightning rods, fires from lightning strikes were constant danger to buildings. Churches, with their tall steeples, were particularly vulnerable. Ironically, these buildings dedicated to God were frequently destroyed by lightning, which many saw as divine judgment. Franklin's invention was beautifully simple. A metal rod placed at the highest point of a building, connected by wire to a rod driven deep into the ground. When lightning struck, electricity followed the path of least resistance down the rod into the earth, harmlessly. This worked spectacularly well. Buildings with lightning rods rarely suffered lightning damage. The invention spread rapidly across America and Europe. There was religious controversy. Some preachers argued that lightning was God's will, and protecting buildings from it was impious. Franklin wryly suggested that this logic would forbid roofs, since they protected from God's rain. His practical argument won. Lightning rods became standard on important buildings. Bifocal glasses, invented around 1784, solved Franklin's personal problem. As he aged, he needed glasses for reading, but different ones for seeing at a distance. Constantly switching between two pairs of glasses was annoying. So Franklin had lenses made that were divided horizontally. The top half was ground for distance vision, the bottom half for reading. Now, he could simply look through the appropriate part of the lens, depending on what he was looking at. Problem solved. This invention has helped millions of people over the centuries. It's still the basic principle behind bifocals today. Franklin invented the flexible urinary catheter to help his brother, who suffered from kidney stones. The existing catheters were rigid and caused terrible pain. Franklin designed a catheter made of flexible materials that could be inserted more gently. This medical device relieved suffering for countless patients. He invented an extension arm for reaching books on high shelves. It was basically a long pole with a grasping mechanism at the end. Simple, practical, still useful. He designed an improved anchor for ships. He invented a new kind of harmonica, musical instrument. He designed swim fins to help people move faster through water. He studied the common cold and argued it was spread by contact between people in close quarters, not by cold air. This was correct, though germ theory wouldn't be established for another century. He investigated the dangers of lead poisoning, noting that people who worked with lead often developed paralysis and other symptoms. He advocated better workplace safety. He mapped the Gulf Stream, the warm ocean current flowing from the Caribbean up the East Coast and across the Atlantic. He created charts helping ships use the current when traveling east and avoid it when traveling west, saving time and fuel. He studied the absorption of heat by different colored materials. He demonstrated that dark colors absorbed more heat than light colors, leading him to suggest wearing light colors in summer. He experimented with oil on water, showing how spreading oil created calmer surface. This led to techniques for calming rough seas. He designed a more efficient ship hull and proposed various nautical improvements. He even invented daylight saving time, proposing that people could save candles by rising earlier during long summer days. This was more satirical suggestion than serious proposal, but the idea influenced later adoption of daylight saving. What united all these inventions was Franklin's approach. Observe a problem, understand its nature, design a solution, test it, improve it based on results. This was scientific method applied to practical life. It was engineering thinking before engineering was formalized profession. Franklin also improved printing techniques. He developed better inks, better type, better methods for producing consistent results. His Pennsylvania Gazette was known for its quality. He introduced paper money designs that were difficult to counterfeit, using nature prints of leaves and other techniques that couldn't be easily reproduced. In his Civic projects, he essentially invented the model of voluntary subscription for public goods. The library, fire company, hospital, all operated on principle of pooling resources through voluntary membership. This was social innovation as important as any technical invention. It created new way of organizing collective action. Franklin's inventive mind never stopped working. Into his 80s, he was still designing, testing, improving. His last letters include suggestions for naval tactics and improvements to ships. What's striking is his generosity with these inventions. He genuinely believed that knowledge should be shared freely for public benefit. In an era when patent law was being established to protect inventors' profits, Franklin consistently chose to give his inventions away. He made his money from printing and land investments, not from inventions. This set a different model for American innovation, the practical tinkerer who invents to solve problems and shares solutions freely. While this model didn't prevent patents and commercial exploitation of inventions from becoming standard, it represented an ideal that influenced American culture. Franklin showed that you could be a brilliant inventor without being driven by profit. You could improve the world because improving the world was its own reward. His inventions improved daily life for millions of people. They saved money, prevented disasters, solved practical problems. And he gave them all away because he believed that's what a decent person should do. This combination of practical genius and generous spirit is rare in history. It's one of the reasons Franklin remains admired centuries after his death. To understand Benjamin Franklin beyond his achievements, we need to look at his character, his strengths, his flaws, his contradictions. Franklin was charming. Almost everyone who met him found him delightful company. He had wit that made people laugh without being cruel. He could discuss serious topics without being boring. He made others feel interesting and valued. This charm was partly natural gift, but partly cultivated skill. Franklin deliberately developed his conversational abilities. He practiced asking questions rather than asserting opinions. He learned to disagree without being disagreeable. In his autobiography, he describes adopting a more humble way of speaking. Instead of saying, certainly, or undoubtedly, he'd say, I imagine, or it appears to me. This made people less defensive and more open to his ideas. This wasn't dishonesty, it was social intelligence. Franklin recognized that how you say something matters as much as what you say. He was also genuinely curious about everything. He asked questions because he actually wanted to know answers. This curiosity made him interesting to talk with and drove his scientific investigations. But Franklin had significant flaws that we shouldn't ignore. His treatment of women in his personal life was complicated and sometimes problematic. He had an illegitimate son, William, whose mother's identity remains uncertain. He essentially abandoned Deborah Franklin in America while he lived in London for years. He enjoyed flirting with women throughout his life, even into old age in Paris. Some of this was harmless gallantry, but some crossed lines by modern standards and probably by standards of his own time. He provided for his family financially, and took responsibility for William. But emotional intimacy and fidelity weren't his strong points. Franklin was also vain, though he tried to cultivate humility. He loved being famous, loved being celebrated in French society, loved seeing his image on snuff boxes and medallions. He presented himself as humble, but clearly enjoyed his achievements and reputation. The self-deprecating humor in his autobiography can't entirely hide his pride in what he'd accomplished. He could be cold and calculating in relationships. When associates were no longer useful, or when relationships soured, Franklin could distance himself completely. He dropped people without much sentiment. His relationship with his son William is revealing. William remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution and became governor of New Jersey for the British. Franklin never forgave him for this choice. They had an irreparable break. Franklin virtually disowned his son, barely mentioning him in his will except to acknowledge debts were settled. For someone who preached forgiveness and moderation, Franklin could be unforgiving toward those he felt had betrayed important principles. His views on Native Americans were mixed. He had more respect for indigenous peoples than many of his contemporaries, but he still viewed European civilization as superior. He advocated for fair treatment and honest dealing, but also supported policies that would ultimately disadvantage indigenous peoples. On slavery, Franklin's evolution shows both the capacity to change and the failure to act strongly earlier. He owned slaves for years before concluding slavery was wrong. His late-life advocacy for abolition was admirable, but we can still ask why it took him so long to reach that conclusion and act on it. Franklin was also sometimes lazy about things that didn't interest him. He procrastinated on unpleasant tasks. He avoided difficult personal conversations. He was better at grand projects than at daily details. His diplomatic dispatches to Congress were often irregular. He didn't always answer letters promptly. When something bored him, he paid less attention. But his positive qualities were substantial and genuine. He was generous with money, time, and knowledge. He helped young people starting out, just as he'd been helped. He contributed to causes he believed in. He shared his discoveries freely. He was brave, willing to take risks for principles. Signing the Declaration of Independence meant risking execution. His diplomatic mission to France was dangerous. He repeatedly put himself in jeopardy for causes he believed in. He was remarkably open-minded for his era. He changed his views when evidence contradicted them. He was willing to learn from anyone, regardless of their status. He had extraordinary work ethic when engaged with something he cared about. He could work intensely for hours, mastering new skills or solving problems. He was loyal to friends and to causes. Once committed, he followed through even when difficult. He had self-awareness unusual for someone so accomplished. He could laugh at himself, admit mistakes, acknowledge limitations. His humor was one of his most attractive qualities. He could diffuse tension with a joke, make difficult topics accessible with wit, help people see themselves more clearly through satire. He was also remarkably resilient. He failed multiple times early in life, but kept going. He faced setbacks in business, science, diplomacy, but didn't give up. When the Hutchinson Letters affair destroyed his reputation in Britain, he could have collapsed in humiliation. Instead, he redirected his energy toward American independence. Franklin's character was a mix of genuine virtue and calculated self-presentation. He tried to be a good person while also managing his reputation. Sometimes these aligned, sometimes they created tension. He wanted to be remembered as wise, virtuous, and accomplished. But he was honest enough in his autobiography to include unflattering stories that make him human rather than plaster saint. Understanding Franklin's character helps us appreciate his achievements without idealizing him unrealistically. He was brilliant, hard-working, charming person who accomplished extraordinary things through talent and effort. He was also vain, sometimes cold, slow to act on some moral issues. Both aspects are true. And perhaps that's the final lesson from Franklin's character. Great people aren't perfect people. They're humans who do great things despite their imperfections. Franklin would probably appreciate being remembered honestly, with both his strengths and weaknesses acknowledged. He valued truth over flattery, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Benjamin Franklin's influence on American culture extends far beyond his specific achievements. He helped create what it means to be American, the American dream, the idea that anyone can rise from humble origins to success through effort and talent is embodied in Franklin's life. He was living proof that birth didn't determine destiny. From candlemaker's son to dining with kings, from runaway apprentice to helping found a nation, from 2 years of formal schooling to honorary degrees from universities, his story became template for American success narratives. Work hard, learn continuously, seize opportunities, improve yourself, serve your community, rise. This narrative has been both inspiring and problematic. Inspiring because it genuinely reflects possibilities that exist in relatively open societies. Problematic because it can ignore structural barriers and blame those who don't rise for lacking sufficient effort. But Franklin's version of this narrative emphasized not just individual success, but social responsibility. He believed successful people should give back, should improve their communities, should use their achievements to benefit others. The self-made man in Franklin's model was also the civic-minded citizen. You didn't just get rich. You built libraries, hospitals, schools. You made your community better. This balanced individualism with social obligation in ways that influenced American culture. Franklin also helped create American scientific and innovative culture. The practical tinkerer who invents useful things became American archetype. Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Steve Jobs all echo Franklin's model. Smart people who turn ideas into practical innovations that change how people live. The emphasis on applied science rather than just theoretical knowledge, on innovation that serves practical purposes, on invention as democratic activity rather than aristocratic pursuit. These are Franklinian themes in American culture. American entrepreneurship also owes something to Franklin. He showed how starting a business could be the path to independence and influence, how identifying needs and serving them created opportunities. The printer who became wealthy by providing valuable services, then used that wealth to pursue other interests, became a model for entrepreneurial success. American diplomacy, at its best, has reflected Franklin's style. Pragmatic rather than ideological, focused on results rather than rigid principles, willing to compromise on details while protecting essential interests. The ugly American who demands others do things our way is one diplomatic tradition. Franklin represents different tradition. The American who listens, adapts, finds common ground, achieves goals through persuasion rather than force. His success in France showed how effective this approach could be. His patient negotiation over years accomplished what military force might not have. American writing style also shows Franklin's influence. Clear, direct prose focused on communicating ideas effectively rather than showing off vocabulary. The unpretentious but intelligent voice that characterizes much American writing, from Mark Twain to E.B. White, echoes Franklin's style. He showed that you could write simply without writing simplistically, that clarity was strength, not weakness, that humor and wisdom could coexist. Franklin's model of voluntary associations for civic improvement became a distinctly American approach to social organization. Americans form associations to address problems at remarkable rates compared to people in other cultures. This impulse to organize, to pool resources, to take collective action without waiting for government traces partly to Franklin's example. Libraries, fire companies, service clubs, charitable organizations, all following the model Franklin demonstrated. American education, with its emphasis on practical skills alongside classical learning, reflects Franklin's influence. The idea that education should prepare people for useful citizenship, not just preserve cultural traditions, became American educational philosophy. Franklin's religious tolerance also influenced American culture. His acceptance of religious diversity, his conviction that different faiths could all promote virtue, his focus on practice rather than doctrine, these became part of American religious culture. The separation of church and state, religious pluralism, the idea that private faith shouldn't dictate public policy, all reflect values Franklin advocated. His influence on American humor shouldn't be underestimated. His wit, his ability to make serious points through humor, his self-deprecating style, these became part of American comedic tradition. Mark Twain explicitly acknowledged Franklin's influence. Many American humorists, from James Thurber to David Sedaris, work in tradition Franklin helped establish. Franklin also influenced how Americans think about money and success. The Protestant work ethic, American style, emphasizing productivity, thrift, investment, comes partly through Franklin's writings. Time is money. A penny saved is a penny earned. These Franklinian maxims became almost scripture for American middle-class economic culture. The positive side was encouraging productive work and prudent management. The negative side was sometimes reducing everything to economic calculation, valuing people primarily for their productivity. Franklin's own life showed more balance than some of his sayings suggested. He worked hard, but also enjoyed life. He made money, but also gave it away. He valued productivity, but also conversation, friendship, pleasure. But the sayings were catchier than the nuanced example, so they had more influence. Franklin's iconography also shaped American culture. His image on the $100 bill makes him literally the face of money in America. His presence at the Revolution's key moments, drafting the Declaration, securing French alliance, negotiating peace, framing the Constitution, makes him embodiment of the founding. Schools, streets, towns, counties, all bear his name across America. He's omnipresent in American geography and memory. But how Franklin is remembered has changed over time. In the 19th century, he was primarily remembered for Poor Richard's maxims about industry and thrift. In the 20th century, as his diplomatic and scientific achievements were better understood, he became a more complex figure. Scientist, statesman, philosopher. Currently, there's more attention to his contradictions. Slaveholder who became abolitionist, advocate of virtue who had complicated personal life, champion of democracy who enjoyed aristocratic society. This more nuanced understanding is probably closer to historical reality. Franklin was brilliant, accomplished, and genuinely devoted to public service. He was also vain, sometimes cold, and slow to act on some moral issues. He's more interesting for being human rather than perfect. And his influence is more valuable because it comes from someone who struggled with real challenges, rather than someone who had easy virtue. Franklin's legacy in American culture is immense and multifaceted. The self-made man, the practical innovator, the civic-minded citizen, the pragmatic diplomat, the witty writer, the scientist-statesman. All these American archetypes owe something to Franklin. He didn't create these ideas from nothing, but he embodied them, demonstrated them, wrote about them in ways that made them central to American identity. Understanding Franklin helps us understand America, its ideals, its contradictions, its possibilities, its limitations. He's woven into the fabric of American culture in ways that persist centuries after his death. Benjamin Franklin was one of the founding fathers, but he was very different from the others. Understanding these differences reveals both Franklin's uniqueness and the diversity of personalities that created America. Franklin was much older than most other founders. When the Revolution began, he was 69. Thomas Jefferson was 33. John Adams was 40. Alexander Hamilton was 20. This age gap meant Franklin brought different perspective. He remembered the early colonial period. He'd lived through decades of colonial development. He had historical memory his younger colleagues lacked. It also meant he was literally everyone's elder. He was treated with respect due to age and achievements. His presence gave gravitas to revolutionary cause. George Washington and Franklin had mutual respect, but weren't close friends. Washington was military leader, precise and dignified. Franklin was more casual, more intellectual. But they recognized each other's value. Washington appreciated Franklin securing French alliance. Franklin supported Washington's military leadership and later his presidency. Their relationship was cordial, professional, but not intimate. They moved in different circles, had different styles, addressed different challenges. Thomas Jefferson and Franklin had warmer relationship. Jefferson admired Franklin's scientific work and writing. He served alongside Franklin in Paris and witnessed his diplomatic success. Jefferson absorbed Franklin's pragmatic approach to diplomacy. He learned from Franklin's ability to navigate French society. Their time together in France influenced Jefferson's thinking. But Jefferson was more ideological than Franklin. He had stronger convictions about democracy, about agrarian life, about French Revolution's importance. Franklin was more flexible, more willing to accept imperfect compromises. Jefferson later wrote admiringly about Franklin, acknowledging his debt to the older man's wisdom and example. John Adams and Franklin had complicated relationship. They worked together in Congress, in Paris negotiating peace, at Constitutional Convention, but they often clashed. Adams was prickly, moralistic, suspicious of luxury and flattery. He thought Franklin was too fond of French society, too willing to accept praise, too lazy about details. Franklin thought Adams was too rigid, too tactless, too quick to take offense. He found Adams exhausting company. They argued about diplomatic strategy in Paris. Adams wanted to confront the French. Franklin wanted to maintain good relations. Their styles were incompatible. But they also respected each other's commitment to American independence. Adams acknowledged Franklin's achievements even while criticizing his methods. Their relationship shows that effective collaboration doesn't require friendship. They worked together successfully despite personal friction. Alexander Hamilton and Franklin had minimal interaction. Hamilton was so much younger, and their careers didn't overlap much. But Hamilton represented a very different approach to American governance than Franklin. Hamilton wanted strong central government, financial system based on debt and banking, industrial development. Franklin emphasized local civic action, saving rather than borrowing, practical innovation over financial manipulation. Hamilton's America and Franklin's America were different visions, though both were legitimate interpretations of American possibilities. James Madison and Franklin also had limited direct interaction, but Madison learned from Franklin's example at Constitutional Convention. Franklin's willingness to compromise, his focus on what could be achieved rather than ideal outcomes, influenced Madison's pragmatic federalism. Madison's Federalist Papers reflected Franklinian realism about human nature and politics. People aren't angels. Government must account for this. Sam Adams, the radical Boston organizer, and Franklin also represented different revolutionary styles. Sam Adams was more confrontational, more willing to use mob action, less diplomatic. Franklin preferred persuasion, negotiation, building consensus. Sam Adams wanted to force issues. Their approaches were complementary but different. Patrick Henry's passionate oratory, "Give me liberty or give me death," was very different from Franklin's wit and wisdom, but both were effective in different contexts. Franklin's generation included other important figures who weren't strictly founding fathers, but influenced American development. Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, met Franklin in London. Franklin encouraged him to come to America. Paine's radical democratic vision went beyond Franklin's more moderate positions, but Franklin supported Paine's writing and defended him when Paine's views became controversial. What distinguished Franklin from most other founders was his international reputation. He was a famous scientist before he was revolutionary. This gave him credibility his colleagues lacked. When Franklin spoke, Europeans listened because of his scientific achievements. Jefferson's ideas might be dismissed as provincial. Franklin's ideas carried weight because he was Dr. Franklin. Franklin was also more comfortable with ambiguity and contradiction than many founders. Jefferson wanted logical consistency. Adams wanted moral clarity. Franklin was comfortable with messy reality. This made him an excellent negotiator, but sometimes frustrated colleagues who wanted clearer principles. Franklin was less interested in political theory than Jefferson or Adams. He didn't write systematic treatises on government. He preferred practical wisdom to philosophical speculation. This pragmatism was strength in creating workable institutions. But it meant Franklin's political philosophy is harder to summarize than Jefferson's or Adams's. Franklin's religious views were also distinctive. While many founders were deists, believing in God but not in traditional Christianity, Franklin was particularly skeptical of religious doctrine. He supported all religions that promoted virtue but didn't commit strongly to any particular faith. This pluralism was more radical than most founders' positions. His class background also set him apart. Most founders came from gentry families, owned land, had advantages from birth. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all were gentlemen planters. Adams was from more modest background, but still had education and status. Franklin alone rose from genuine poverty and working-class origins. This shaped his perspective. He understood ordinary people's lives better than colleagues born to privilege. He had less automatic respect for hierarchy and tradition. Despite these differences, Franklin collaborated effectively with other founders because he focused on shared goals rather than personal disagreements. They all wanted American independence. They all believed in creating a republic. They all were willing to risk everything for these goals. The diversity of personalities and perspectives among founders was probably strength. No single vision dominated. Compromises were necessary. This created more balanced institutions than any one person's ideal might have. Franklin's role was often as mediator, finding common ground, smoothing personal conflicts, keeping people focused on what mattered. At Constitutional Convention, when debates became heated, Franklin's presence and occasional interventions helped maintain civility and progress. Understanding Franklin in context of other founders reveals his distinctive contributions. He wasn't the most theoretically sophisticated thinker. He wasn't the most passionate revolutionary. He wasn't the most systematic political philosopher. But he was the most internationally respected, the most skilled at building consensus, the most comfortable with practical compromise, the most able to communicate complex ideas simply. The American founding needed all these different personalities and skills. Franklin's contributions were unique and essential. Benjamin Franklin returned from France in 1785 at age 79. He'd spent 9 years in Paris, accomplishing extraordinary diplomatic feats. Now he was home in Philadelphia for his final years. His health was poor and declining. Kidney stones caused constant pain. Gout limited his mobility. He'd lived a long life, but his body was wearing out. Yet he remained active and engaged. He couldn't stop being Franklin, couldn't stop working, thinking, contributing. He was elected president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council in October 1785, essentially the governor position. He served 3 one-year terms until 1788. At nearly 80, he was heading Pennsylvania's government. This shows both his continued respect in Philadelphia and his inability to truly retire. The position wasn't too demanding. The council handled executive functions, but Pennsylvania had limited executive power. Franklin could delegate most work while providing symbolic leadership. He hosted diplomatic visitors. He attended official functions. He signed documents. He lent his prestige to Pennsylvania government without needing to do daily administrative work. But his most important political contribution in these final years was participating in the Constitutional Convention in 1787. We've discussed his role there already, but it's worth emphasizing that this participation, at age 81 in failing health, showed extraordinary dedication. The summer heat in Philadelphia was brutal. Sitting through long debates was exhausting. His pain was constant. He could have stayed home, and nobody would have criticized him. But he attended, participated, contributed. His final major public service was helping create the Constitution. After the convention, Franklin focused more on writing and personal projects. His autobiography, which he'd worked on intermittently for years, occupied much of his attention. He never finished it. The narrative ends in 1758, when he was 52. The final 32 years, including the Revolution and his diplomatic career, were never written. This is frustrating for historians. We have detailed account of his early years, but only letters and others' accounts of his later achievements. But the autobiography's influence didn't depend on being complete. What he did write shaped how Americans thought about self-improvement and success for generations. He also wrote numerous letters, essays, and short pieces. His mind remained sharp, even as his body failed. He couldn't resist commenting on politics, science, society. In 1787, he became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. This was one of America's first abolitionist organizations. Franklin's anti-slavery position evolved late in life. He'd owned slaves earlier, but by the 1780s, he was convinced slavery was immoral and should be ended. In his final year, 1790, he signed a petition to Congress calling for abolition of slavery. It was one of his last public acts. The petition was controversial. Southern congressmen were outraged that anyone would question slavery. Franklin was attacked in congressional debates. He responded with a satirical essay, supposedly written by a North African Muslim, defending the enslavement of Christians. He used exact same arguments that Southern congressmen used defending slavery of Africans, showing how absurd they were. This satire, written weeks before his death, showed Franklin's wit was intact until the end. Franklin's household in these final years included his daughter Sally and her family. William Franklin, his son who'd stayed loyal to Britain, was excluded. Franklin barely mentioned William in his will, except to acknowledge old debts were settled. The breach was complete and permanent. This harsh treatment of his son shows Franklin could be unforgiving despite preaching forgiveness. Personal disloyalty to the revolutionary cause was something he couldn't overlook. His relationship with Sally was warmer. She cared for him in his final illness. He was fond of her children, his grandchildren. They brought him joy in his declining years. Friends visited regularly. Scientists, politicians, writers, all came to pay respects and enjoy his conversation. He remained fascinating company, even confined to his house by pain. Thomas Jefferson visited when in Philadelphia. Other founders stopped by. Franklin's home was gathering place for people wanting wisdom, wit, and connection to revolutionary history. He continued scientific interests as health allowed. He corresponded with European scientists. He theorized about various natural phenomena. He invented a mechanical chair that converted into library steps so he could reach high books despite mobility problems. Even in pain, his inventive mind worked. He revised his will carefully, distributing property thoughtfully. He left money to Boston and Philadelphia for loan funds that would help young craftsmen start businesses. These funds still exist. The Boston Fund helped establish Franklin Institute. The Philadelphia Fund supports Franklin Institute of Technology. His practical charity continues over 2 centuries later. As 1790 progressed, Franklin's health deteriorated further. The pain from kidney stones became excruciating. He had difficulty breathing. He knew he didn't have much time. He faced death with the same practical mindset he'd brought to everything. He wasn't particularly religious in traditional sense, but he believed in God and in virtue. He told friends he'd lived a good life, accomplished worthwhile things, and was ready to see what came next. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died at age 84. His daughter and grandchildren were with him. News of his death spread quickly. Philadelphia went into mourning. Businesses closed. Bells rang. Thousands attended his funeral. Congress officially mourned for 1 month. This was unprecedented honor. Franklin was the first person so honored by Congress. In France, the National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning. This was extraordinary. A foreign legislature mourning an American citizen had never happened before. It showed how deeply French respected Franklin. He wasn't just American diplomat to them. He was Enlightenment philosopher, scientist, symbol of virtue and wisdom they admired. French eulogies emphasized his scientific contributions, his diplomatic skill, his embodiment of Enlightenment values. They saw him as citizen of the world, not just America. His funeral in Philadelphia was largest the city had ever seen. 20,000 people attended, roughly half the city's population. The funeral procession included printers, members of his various civic organizations, government officials, ordinary citizens. All of Philadelphia seemed to be there. He was buried next to Deborah in Christ Church burial ground. The simple stone marker, as Franklin requested, reads only, Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. No elaborate monument, no grand statements, just names. This simplicity was quintessentially Franklin. Eulogies emphasized different aspects of his achievements depending on audience. Scientists mourned the electrical pioneer. Politicians mourned the founding father. Writers mourned the brilliant prose stylist. Everyone mourned the loss of someone who'd enriched their world through intelligence, energy, and generosity. Franklin left a nation he'd helped create and a legacy of ideas, innovations, and institutions that would outlive him by centuries. His final years showed he couldn't stop contributing even when his body was failing. He had to keep working, keep thinking, keep trying to make the world better. This drive to be useful until the end was perhaps his most admirable quality. He could have coasted on his achievements. Instead, he worked until he literally couldn't anymore. 230 years after Franklin's death, what does his life still teach us? Why should we care about this 18th century printer, scientist, diplomat? First, Franklin's life demonstrates the power of self-education and continuous learning. He had less than 2 years of formal schooling, but became one of the most educated people in the world. In our era of vast educational opportunities, Franklin reminds us that formal credentials aren't everything. Curiosity, discipline, and relentless self-improvement can accomplish extraordinary things. He read voraciously. He practiced writing until he mastered it. He studied science until he made original discoveries. He taught himself languages, mathematics, philosophy. Nobody gave him this education. He took it for himself, and anyone with access to books and determination could do the same. Today, with the internet providing almost unlimited free educational resources, Franklin's example is more relevant than ever. The barriers to learning have never been lower. Second, Franklin's civic engagement shows the power of voluntary association and community action. He didn't wait for government to build libraries, fire companies, hospitals. He organized people, pooled resources, made things happen. This model of civic improvement is still vital. Many contemporary problems could be addressed through Franklin's approach: identify need, organize interested people, pool resources, take action. Not everything requires government programs or corporate investment. Sometimes what's needed is people deciding to work together. Third, Franklin's scientific method and practical innovation remain models for problem solving. Observe carefully, form hypotheses, test them, learn from results. Apply knowledge to improve lives. Share discoveries freely. This approach works for scientific research, but also for business, education, social problems. Franklin's experimental mindset is universally applicable. Fourth, Franklin's diplomatic style offers lessons for navigating disagreement and building consensus. In our polarized era, Franklin's ability to find common ground, to compromise without surrendering principles, to disagree without being disagreeable, seems increasingly valuable. He showed that you can be firmly committed to important goals while remaining flexible about methods. That charm and humor can accomplish more than confrontation. Fifth, Franklin's evolution on issues like slavery shows that people can change their views when confronted with evidence and moral arguments. He wasn't born an abolitionist. He accepted slavery as normal for decades. But he was capable of recognizing he'd been wrong and changing course. In our era of rigid ideological positions, Franklin's intellectual flexibility and willingness to admit error are worth emulating. Sixth, Franklin's balanced life offers model for human flourishing. He worked hard, but also enjoyed pleasures. He pursued wealth, but also gave generously, valued success, but also friendship and conversation. He wasn't Puritan ascetic or hedonist. He was both productive and joyful. This balance seems increasingly difficult in our always-on culture. Franklin knew when to work intensely and when to relax. He valued both achievement and relationships. He pursued both knowledge and pleasure. Seventh, Franklin's writings on self-improvement speak to contemporary self-help culture. His method of deliberately cultivating virtues, of tracking progress, of systematic self-development, anticipates modern approaches to personal growth. The difference is Franklin's humility about it. He admitted he never achieved perfection. He made progress but retained flaws. He tried to improve but remained human. This realistic approach to self-improvement seems healthier than perfectionist demands that generate guilt and shame. Eighth, Franklin's entrepreneurial success offers lessons for business. He identified needs and served them well. He built reputation for quality. He developed multiple income streams. He knew when to retire from daily operations while retaining financial benefits. His business principles, thrift, industry, reliability, reputation, still work. Ninth, Franklin's later life productivity challenges retirement assumptions. He was 70 when he returned from France, 81 at Constitutional Convention. He kept contributing until he physically couldn't. In our era of longer life expectancies, Franklin's example suggests retirement doesn't mean disengagement. Experienced people can keep contributing in roles suited to their capabilities. 10th, Franklin's practical wisdom, his ability to express insight in memorable phrases, shows the power of clear communication. In our era of information overload, the ability to distill ideas into memorable form is more valuable than ever. Franklin was brilliant at this. His sayings endure because they combine truth with verbal craftsmanship. They were wise and well expressed. Both qualities mattered. But we should also note what Franklin can't teach us. He operated in very different society. His path from poverty to prominence, while impressive, was available partly because of privileges we shouldn't ignore. He was white and male in society that limited opportunities for women and enslaved Africans. His success was partly due to talent and effort, but partly due to advantages others lacked. His personal life, particularly treatment of women, doesn't provide model to emulate. His willingness to abandon his wife for years, his probable infidelities, his treatment of William, these are cautionary examples, not ideals. His comfortable relationships with slavery for much of his life remind us that even brilliant people can fail to recognize moral evils of their time. We should learn from Franklin critically, not uncritically. Take what's valuable, acknowledge what's problematic. His intellectual curiosity, his civic engagement, his diplomatic skill, his practical innovation, his readable writing, his capacity to change views, his balanced approach to life, all these remain valuable. His personal flaws, his slow recognition of slavery's evil, his participation in systems that excluded many, these remind us that admirable people aren't perfect people. Franklin would probably appreciate this balanced assessment. He was honest about his own imperfections in his autobiography. He valued truth over flattery. The question isn't, was Franklin perfect? Obviously not. The question is, what can we learn from his example that makes our lives and communities better? And there's much to learn. His life demonstrates that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things through continuous learning, hard work, civic engagement, and practical wisdom. He shows that success should include service, that innovation should benefit society, that you can rise while lifting others. He demonstrates the power of curiosity, of experimentation, of willingness to change your mind. He shows that diplomacy requires patience, that conflict requires compromise, that difference should be navigated with humor and grace. These lessons remain valuable regardless of how society has changed since Franklin's time. Benjamin Franklin wasn't perfect, but he was remarkable, and his example still has much to teach us if we're willing to learn.
Benjamin Franklin's lasting influence owes much to his skill as a writer. Unlike many intellectuals who write for other intellectuals, Franklin wrote for ordinary people, with prose that was accessible without being simplistic, wise without being pompous. Poor Richard's almanac exemplified his genius. While others published almanacs with useful data, Franklin added personality and wisdom that made his the most popular. His sayings, "A stitch in time saves 9, haste makes waste, lost time is never found again," worked because they were short, rhythmic, and expressed practical wisdom everyone could relate to. Franklin understood people remember catchy phrases better than elaborate explanations. His autobiography is a masterpiece of American prose, remarkably readable despite being written in the 1770s-80s. The intimate opening addressed to his son William creates personal tone. His descriptions are vivid and concrete. We can see him arriving in Philadelphia with 3 puffy rolls. His honesty about mistakes makes him sympathetic. The episodic structure keeps it engaging. His political writings showed versatility. He could write serious arguments and devastating satires. rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one, used irony brilliantly, supposedly advising Britain on maintaining empire, while actually listing all the stupid policies alienating the colonies. An edict by the King of Prussia pretended Prussia claimed authority over Britain, using the exact logic Britain used for America, demolishing British arguments by showing their absurdity. His scientific writing modelled clarity. Letters describing electrical experiments were comprehensible to educated non-scientists without jargon, helping his ideas spread across Europe. Franklin's writing influenced American prose style for generations. His clarity, directness, and accessibility became ideals. Mark Twain acknowledged his influence. Hemingway's stripped-down prose echoes Franklin's economy. The American preference for plain speaking over elaborate rhetoric owes something to Franklin's example. He pioneered modern journalism techniques, combining news, opinion, and entertainment in the Pennsylvania Gazette. His pseudonymous letters arguing with himself under different names anticipated op-ed debates. What made Franklin effective? Clarity, simplicity, concreteness, rhythm, personality, humor, purpose, and revision. He understood words matter. How you say something affects whether it's heard, believed, remembered, and acted upon. His mastery of words gave him power to shape opinions, spread knowledge, and influence events. Understanding Benjamin Franklin completely requires examining aspects that don't fit the admirable founding father image. Franklin's treatment of his wife Deborah was often neglectful and sometimes cruel. They had a common-law marriage in 1730, and she raised William, Franklin's illegitimate son from an unknown mother, as her own. When Franklin went to London in 1757, supposedly for brief business, he stayed most of the next 18 years. Deborah refused to cross the Atlantic due to fear of sea travel, so they lived apart. Franklin seemed comfortable with this arrangement, enjoying London society with his landlady Mrs. Stevenson and her daughter Polly as surrogate family. Deborah died in 1774 after a stroke. Franklin wasn't with her. He was still in London despite knowing she was unwell. He didn't rush back for her final months or funeral, returning only after she'd been dead for months. This was abandonment by most moral standards. When his son William chose loyalty to Britain during the Revolution, Franklin cut him off completely. The estrangement was total and permanent. Franklin barely mentioned William in his will, except to acknowledge debts were settled, essentially disinheriting him. Political loyalty trumped family bonds, in ways suggesting Franklin could be cold and unforgiving. Franklin's relationships with women in Paris were complicated. His flirtations with Madame Brillon and Madame Helvetius included playful romantic language going beyond mere gallantry. At minimum, these show Franklin compartmentalizing, being an affectionate husband in letters to Deborah, while conducting flirtatious relationships with French women. Franklin's acceptance of slavery for most of his life is a significant moral failing. He owned slaves, bought and sold them through his newspaper, and didn't question slavery seriously until relatively late in life. Only in his final years did he become an active abolitionist. While his evolution shows admirable capacity to change, he participated in enormous moral evil for decades. His slowness probably stemmed from questioning slavery, threatening economic interests, and social norms he benefited from. Franklin's scientific reputation has complications. While his electrical work was genuinely original, some other scientific claims were speculative or wrong. His confident claims sometimes rested on limited evidence. His diplomacy, while effective, involved manipulating both the French and American superiors. He provided selective information to Congress, negotiated peace with Britain without fully consulting France as instructed, and played different parties against each other. This pragmatic duplicity achieved results, but raises ethical questions. Franklin's vanity was significant. Despite claiming humility, he loved being famous and celebrated, enjoying seeing his image on French medallions and appreciating flattery. These imperfections don't erase his achievements, but remind us he was human with significant flaws alongside virtues. Benjamin Franklin's sayings from Poor Richard's Almanac have become so embedded in American culture that many quote them without knowing their source. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Possibly Franklin's most famous saying, combining practical advice with memorable rhythm and rhyme. While the advice is debatable, it expresses values of discipline, productivity, and order. A penny saved is a penny earned. Fundamental principle of thrift that became American financial wisdom. Saving money equals making money because both increase wealth. Time is money. Possibly Franklin's most consequential contribution to capitalist thinking, treating time as economic resource to be invested wisely. It's brilliant metaphor but problematic philosophy, reducing all activities to economic calculations. God helps them that help themselves, often mistaken for biblical quotation, but actually Franklin's creation, expressing conviction that people must take responsibility for improvement. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. Humorous observation with literal truth-making point about hospitality. The humor makes the potentially awkward point palatable. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Dark humor about trust and discretion that resonates because most people have experienced betrayed confidences. An investment in knowledge pays the best interest. Expresses Franklin's deep conviction about education's value, encouraging spending on learning because knowledge enables everything else. Well done is better than well said. Anti-rhetoric saying valuing action over talk. Striking coming from someone as skilled with words as Franklin. Energy and persistence conquer all things. Became mantra for American achievement culture. Franklin's own life exemplified this. He succeeded through relentless effort more than natural genius. Lost time is never found again. Makes time's irretrievable nature vivid. Beautiful phrasing of important truth about time's value. These sayings work because they're short enough to remember, specific enough to seem concrete, general enough to apply broadly, rhythmic, true enough to resonate, and humorous enough to entertain. Franklin had genius for distilling wisdom into memorable form. Many weren't original. He collected proverbs from various sources and polished them. His genius was partly in selection and partly in expression. The sayings have limitations. They're practical wisdom, not philosophical depth, and some contradict each other. But they provide principles to consider, not rigid rules. They've shaped American culture for nearly 3 centuries, woven into how Americans think about success, time, money, and virtue. Remarkable achievement for 18th century sayings. Benjamin Franklin wasn't just an American founder, he was an international figure whose influence extended far beyond colonial America. In France, 1776-1785, Franklin became a cultural phenomenon. French intellectuals saw him as embodying Enlightenment values. Rational, scientifically minded, practical, virtuous without religious dogmatism. His electrical experiments had already made him famous in European scientific circles as Dr. Franklin. French society embraced him enthusiastically. His image appeared on medallions, snuff boxes, rings, and prints, a merchandising campaign that would impress modern marketers. Ladies wore their hair à la Franklin. His simple brown coat and fur cap became fashionable symbols of American simplicity. Franklin played this role brilliantly, presenting himself as plain American, uncorrupted by European aristocratic decadence. Calculated image management. The famous inscription,
Erupuit caelo, fulmen sceptrumque tyrannis. He snatched lightning from the sky and the scepter from tyrants, elevated him to mythological status. When Franklin died, the French National Assembly declared a mourning period, unprecedented honor for a foreign citizen. French Revolution leaders saw him as an inspiring figure, proving ordinary persons could become statesmen through merit. In Britain, his reputation was complicated. Before revolution, he was celebrated scientist and respected colonial representative, Royal Society member, Copley Medal winner, holder of honorary degrees. But revolution made him a traitor. After American independence, British gradually reconsidered, admiring his scientific achievements and role in creating stable government. In Germany and other European countries, Franklin was known primarily as scientist. Lightning rods were adopted from Moscow to Madrid. His scientific papers were translated into multiple languages, influencing how European scientists approached research. In Latin America, Franklin symbolized republicanism and successful resistance to colonial power. Independence leaders like Simon Bolivar looked to American Revolution for inspiration. Franklin's international reputation rested on scientific achievement transcending boundaries, Enlightenment values appealing to educated Europeans, revolutionary success inspiring colonized peoples, literary skill making ideas accessible across languages, diplomatic success demonstrating American equality with European counterparts, and personal charm creating admirers everywhere. Franklin showed Americans could achieve international stature through intellectual achievement rather than military conquest or hereditary nobility. This was revolutionary. In the 18th century, international fame came from royal birth or military victory. Franklin achieved it through experiments, writing, and diplomatic skill, establishing a model for American influence, achievement through talent and innovation. His international friendships were genuine and extensive. He corresponded with scientists, philosophers, and statesmen across Europe in real intellectual exchanges. His vision included international cooperation on scientific and humanitarian projects. His refusal to patent inventions expressed international humanitarianism. Franklin's international legacy includes making America intellectually respectable in European eyes, demonstrating merit could create international reputation, establishing scientific collaboration across borders, and inspiring independence movements. He made America matter to the world. As we close this journey through Benjamin Franklin's life, one insight rises above all. Franklin's greatest invention was himself. He wasn't born into privilege, wealth, or elite education. Everything he became, printer, scientist, diplomat, statesman, was the product of deliberate, lifelong self-creation. At 10, a candlemaker's son with barely 2 years of schooling. At 30, successful printer. At 42, businessman turning towards science. At 50, internationally known experimenter. At 70, revolutionary leader. At 80, constitution framer. Every decade brought reinvention. He never stopped growing. Franklin's method was remarkably modern. Identify a goal, make a plan, practice consistently, track progress, adjust. He aimed for virtue but accepted imperfection. His philosophy of improvement was ambitious yet humble. Strive to be better, knowing you'll never be flawless. Franklin was full of productive contradictions. American yet cosmopolitan, practical yet intellectual, ambitious yet civic-minded, humorous yet serious, principled yet pragmatic. He proved you don't have to choose between success and service, thinking and doing, enjoying life and improving it. His approach to truth was complex. Personally, he believed in honesty. Publicly, especially in diplomacy, He used strategic deception when it served independence. He understood rigid consistency isn't always possible. Different contexts demand different tools. Franklin's legacy shaped American identity in countless ways. Belief in rising through merit, focus on innovation, culture of civic associations, plain-spoken writing style, entrepreneurial mindset, practical diplomatic approach, and the idea that self-improvement is lifelong duty. But his life also teaches caution. He sometimes neglected personal relationships for public achievement. He accepted inequalities before recognizing their moral cost. He was generous, yet vain. These flaws don't negate his greatness, they make him human. For modern listeners, Franklin's lessons remain powerful. Keep learning, serve others, combine practicality with wisdom, embrace compromise when necessary, cultivate humor, stay involved in community, and write clearly. But also, guard relationships, confront injustice even when inconvenient, and be honest about your ego. Franklin lived 84 extraordinary years. The runaway apprentice became founding father. The candlemaker's son helped design a nation. His story is not destiny, but curiosity, discipline, strategy, and relentless growth. His final gift is simple but profound. Human potential can be built, life can be shaped. You can reinvent yourself, you can improve your world. 2 centuries after his death, Franklin still matters, not as perfect hero, but as brilliant, flawed human who proved what dedication can make possible.